Alright, so I've got this Vizio here. It's a 42-inch HDTV10A. I think it's a P42HDTV10A. And it's got a very dim picture. Even though the contrast and the brightness are cranked up as high as it'll go, it's still got a very dim picture. So I know the panel's not being driven correctly. And so we're going to talk about repairing this to have a good usable picture again. Also, it's not it's hard to see in the video, but the dark areas have a predominance of red pixels, so the drive signal to the plasma panel is just not correct. It's got a very severe case of over diffusion. So we're going to look at repairing that today. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check the two fuses on the Y sustain board. And they're both good. No opens there. So that's a good preliminary check that the fuses on the Y sustain board are both good. Next I'll check the fuses on the Z sustain board. Alright, now here's the Z sustain board. We'll go ahead and check the fuses here. That one appears to be open. That one's good. So I can pretty safely say the problem on this set is on the Z sustain board. So let's check from ground to one side of the fuse. Oh yeah, it's a dead short. So that's a pretty good indication that we've definitely got a problem on this board. You can use, move this over just a little bit, you can use this screw or any metal part on the chassis. You can use the back of the plasma panel as ground, or any screw. There's a dead short to ground right there. So we know the problem is definitely on the Z sustain board on this one. So we're going to address replacing or repairing the Z sustain board. We could simply just replace it. You could order a new Z sustain board. I think they're right around $100 for a new board, if you can still find one. There's plenty of used boards out there, but I strongly advise against replacing a Y or a Z sustain with a used board, just because the temperature that these sets run, these ICs, the big IPMs on these, generate so much heat, and they do break down over time. So it's always best to replace either the board with a new board or replace the IC with a new IC. And on this particular set I've ordered new ICs, so I'm going to replace the IPM on the Z sustain board as well as the IPM over here on the Y sustain board, just to make sure that it's going to be a good solid repair and it's going to last. And there's one other thing I wanted to mention on this model, or on all these models. These are made by LG Lucky Goldstar, and we've determined it's got a blown fuse on the Z sustain board, but the Y sustain board fuses check fine. So we want to power up the set, and with our voltmeter in the volt position, I have this one on the 600 volt scale. We want to make sure that our VA and our VS are both working fine from the power supply. And that can be done on this model by just checking the fuses quite easily. Otherwise, if you look closely where the power supply plugs come in, you can see that they're labeled. This first pin says 5 volts, so if I check there, I should have 5 volts. The next pin is ground. The pin after that is VA, which is 60 volts on this model, and then ground, 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 open space, and then the next two pins are the VS. 187. You can also look on the plasma panel itself right over here. Let's see if I can swing the camera around. And it's upside down, but you can see it talks about VA should be 60 and VS should be 188. It's still within 1 volt of that, so I'm going to call this one perfectly acceptable. Okay, so I've got the board out of the set here, and we're going to be talking next about removing the IC chip here, the large pack. All these connections right in here need to be unsoldered so the chip can come out. This is a double-sided circuit board. Double-sided board, which means it's going to require an extreme amount of heat to get it to come unsoldered, because underneath here, I don't know if you can see it, but the pins are soldered on both the top and the bottom of the circuit board, which makes it incredibly hard to get this unsoldered. So I have two items that I use to unsolder these chips, and the first is an electric heat gun. It comes in quite handy for heating up circuit boards. I've used it to remove BGA chips, ball gate array chips, RAM chips. It just comes in quite handy. They're really inexpensive. I think it was $20 to $30. It's got a high and a low. I always use low. I never use high. And the second thing that I use is an electric desoldering iron. This one has a vacuum pump in it, and so the tip itself has a small hole in it, and so you apply the heat to the pin you want to desolder. Once it's heated through, you just press the button. It vacuums the solder up into this little chamber right here. So if you're serious about doing these work, this kind of work, it's always a good idea to have one of these if you're going to be very serious about it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the circuit board and I'm going to preheat it and get it ready to go. So using the low setting of the heat gun, I'm just going to go over these pins. It takes usually about 5 or 10 minutes to get it up hot enough where the solder can be vacuumed out very easily. Also keep in mind that this is lead-free solder on these sets, so it does have a much higher melting point than standard lead tin solder has. So if you just keep going around these pins back and forth, applying heat, eventually, even without a solder sucker, you'll be able to get this IC off. The circuit boards can handle this much heat. I've never done damage to a circuit board doing this yet, and I've changed probably 10 or 20 of these chips so far. So if you just are very persistent and just keep watching, eventually you'll get it heated up. And when this gets heated up, you can actually just lift the circuit board off of the IC. It'll just come right out. Then you can always address removing the solder from the holes later. Alright, so I've got the board good and hot, so I'm going to start desoldering the pins one by one. And it just vacuums the solder right off of them. If you wanted to give it just a few more minutes of heat, you could just virtually lift the circuit board off. The chip would just stay on the table. Alright, so I've got all the pins unsoldered now. It should, if everything goes well, just lift right off the board. Should take just the tiniest amount of prying to break it free. It's very hot, so you have to be very careful at this point.
Because with Humira, remission is possible. Humira has been proven to work for adults who have tried other medications but still experience the symptoms of moderate to severe Crohn's disease. In clinical studies, the majority of patients on Humira saw significant symptom relief, and many achieved remission. Humira can lower your ability to fight infections, including tuberculosis. Serious, sometimes fatal events such as infections, lymphoma, or other types of cancer have happened. Blood, liver, and nervous system problems, serious allergic reactions, and new or worsening heart failure.
That's why it wouldn't come off.
It's in all programs under Lexmark.
So I've got the chip off the board, and you can see all the holes are nice and clean. Ready for the new one to go back on there.
Weeks.
So it's always a good idea once you have the chip off the board to check these diodes here. Make sure none of them are shorted. Use your meter on the diode scale. That one's great. That one checks good. As well as checking these transistors. Just want to make sure there's no shorts on them. So if you find one that has a short, definitely want to replace it. Okay, so the parts that I'm replacing is the YPPD-J018E, and the ones I'm replacing it with are going to be the STKs. This one happens to be a STK795-820. So I've got two of these ICs. They're both exactly the same. So we're going to replace one on the Y sustain, one on the Z sustain, just to prevent future failures. Well, I've got the new chip in here and it's all soldered up and ready to go. And one thing I forgot to mention is that when you do replace these ICs, make sure you scrape off all the old heatsink compound and apply new compound to them evenly on both sides of the IC and the heatsink. And don't be afraid to rub it around. Put the chip on the heatsink, tighten the screws down, and make sure that it does, a little bit of it squeezes out. That way you're sure that it's got 100% heatsink contact. So here's our Y sustain board. I've just finished once again replacing the IPM on it as well. Checked all the solder connections on it. They all look really good. And then here's my two ICs that I've replaced. So this is going to get many more years of use out of this set by replacing both IPMs as opposed to just changing one and having the other one fail shortly after. So I always recommend that you change both modules at the same time. On some of the 50-inch sets, you'll find there's actually 4 modules that you need to change simultaneously. Otherwise, it's just going to be problems. It's going to be callbacks. So let's go ahead and put these two boards back in the set, and fire it up, and take a look at the picture. Alright, so here's our same set after we've changed the parts in there. Just for future reference, if you ever have one of these sets, virtually any Vizio that you have and you need to do some work on it, if you have an LG remote, they're all coded the same. That's because the first Vizios were manufactured by LG. In fact, this one is an LG TV, other than the main system control boards made by Vizio. So let's go ahead and go into the menu. You can see how much brighter the menu is now, and we'll go ahead and turn the brightness and the contrast back down to where it should be. Actually, usually the contrast up pretty high, looks pretty good, but on this one they were both at 50-50 when it came in. I just turned it up for representation. So there we go. It's all working great. It's got a nice clear picture now. No problems with it, and I think we're going to have one happy customer.